October 18th, 2004, and we're at 472 North Street, Burlington, Vermont, at the home of Rabbi Max B. Wall. I'd like you to start by telling about where you were born, where you grew up, and some of your family history, and I can ask more prompting questions as you go.
Well, I was born in Poland in 1915 in a small town not too far from Brest-Litovsk. I lived in Poland for the first 6 years of my life, and then in 21 we came to the States, and we lived in Denver, Colorado until 1928. In 28 we moved to New York City, and we lived there until I went off to service in World War II. Most of my education was in New York City. I'm a graduate of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and before that, Yeshiva University. And before that, I went to what they sometimes call parochial school, what we call yeshivas. The only secular school that I ever attended was the 6 years that I lived in Denver. I have a liberal arts degree from Yeshiva University and a master's and rabbi degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Let me go back for a minute and tell an experience. I was born in a very small town. It's called Ratne. I don't think you'll find it on the average map. But shortly after I was born, a couple of weeks after I was born, my parents were told that the Cossacks are coming. Cossacks were great friends of the Jews, as you know. So my family fled. And they came to a little town called Macheyev. And there, the rabbi took this young couple with their 2.5 weeks old baby in until they found a place where to live. So for the next 6 years, he was sort of my absent grandfather. He dandled me on his knee, gave me candy, he taught me the alphabet, and that kind of stuff. So he was the most important man in Machev to me. Well, this little baby is a 30-year-old American Army chaplain now. And as I'm driving into one of the two large DP camps right outside of Munich, Camp Feldafing, somebody yells out, "Herr Rabbiner, there's a bris." A bris, a circumcision feast. In October 45, there were not too many bris yet. So I drove over to where they were holding the bris and congratulated the bride, the mother and father. And I said, conversationally, where are you from? They were DPs. She had lost a husband and 2 children. He had lost a wife and 2 children. They'd met among the partisans when they escaped from a labor camp. She says, from Poland? So that's strange. I come from Poland myself. She says, V, where? I said, it's a very small town. You probably never heard of it. She says, Avshe, maybe. So I said, Macheyev. She said, you come from Macheyev. I come from Machev. So the only person I knew in Machev was the Machev Rav. So I said, do you know the Machev Rav? So he was my Zayda. He was my grandfather. That was an interesting coincidence. Call it whatever you will. I was married in 1942, the same year I was graduated from the seminary. And I took a pulpit for the first year in a small town in southern New Jersey, Woodbury, New Jersey, right near Camden, Philadelphia. While I was waiting to be processed for my application, I had volunteered to join the military as a chaplain. And October 43, I was assigned to Fort Devens. I was assigned to Harvard University. I knew I'd get into Harvard somehow, but this was only for the chaplain school for 5 weeks. And then my first assignment, and I didn't have any money at all. I was looking forward to getting some travel expense money from the Army, you know. they used to pay so much more that it never cost quite as much as they paid, so you got a few extra dollars. Well, my good fortune, instead of being sent to Fort Lewis, Washington, or someplace in California, I was sent from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Fort Devens, Mass. I think I got a travel pay for something like $1.72. And I was there for from December 43 until October 44, when I was shipped overseas. I was shipped overseas to replace a chaplain who had been killed, a Jewish chaplain who had been killed in France while picking up wounded in a field that had been hit by shrapnel. Chaplain Irving Tepper. And I was eventually assigned to the 9th Division, which was the division he had been assigned to. I joined the division about 3.5 weeks before the bulge began. So I was innocent enough not to know what I should be afraid of, because I was afraid all the time. Mekenga Haggadah, as they say in Yiddish, you can get killed. And you could. You could see dead animals. The first town of any size that I came to was the old Holy Roman Empire, the capital, Aachen, Germany, Aix-la-Chapelle. There wasn't a house that had a roof on it. As a matter of fact, the engineers had put up a little sign quoting Hitler, "Give me 5 years and you will not recognize Germany." And I served there with the division as the Jewish chaplain for the special troops area. I was assigned to headquarters so they could beam over Mobile. He had been assigned to a regiment. And I served there from beginning of December, the end of November, in 44 until I was sent home finally in April of 46. So we still had about 5 months of warfare and lots of killing. And then along came the peace in May, and with that came a plethora of brand new problems. Those problems for a Jew, for a rabbi, involved especially the dealing with the remainder, the She'eri Tapleta, the surviving remnant of what was one time 13 million Jews in Europe. And it was unbelievably unpredictable and rough and very depressing. I'll give you a few experiences. I was glad I was a chaplain because I had the mobility and the freedom of making choices of what to do. That had nobody checking up on me. Well, you were supposed to be here. It's 5 o'clock and you weren't there. So I was able to go around to the former slave camps and contact the DPs. Early on, before we opened up the large camps, like in the west, like Dachau, and a little later on in the east, like the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and so on, we encountered numbers of not formal concentration camps, but basically slave camps, Arbeitslagern, where the slave labor used to live until they died. And occasionally some of them would escape. So we encountered individuals earlier than we encountered the mass. And I met some of those individuals. I realized the problems we had because they weren't afraid of anything. They had faced through Hitler and absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Peace came, and of course there was the end of military action. And it wasn't like Iraq today. That was it.
Really over.
That was it.
Really over.
I never felt the slightest threat riding in an open Jeep. Not like our boys in Iraq today. I was sitting in my office one day. It must have been around maybe June or July. Maybe June. 45. There's a knock on my door. I look up, there's a bunch of pajama-clad people. Herr Rabbiner, the equivalent in spoken English, Rabbi? Yeah. I said, wir sind Juden, we're Jews. I says, kommen Sie rein, come in. What are you doing in these pajama clothes? The UNRWA had just, the United Nations Relief Organization, had just, it was called the United Nations Relief Organization before the UN was established as such. What are you doing without clothes? They had distributed clothing and food rations and even places where to sleep. Well, so they wouldn't give us anything because we're Jews. So that's, come with me. So I zipped up my jacket. On my collar they had on one side the rank, and on the other side they had the service branch, chaplains. It was a Magen David with the Ten Commandments with a Magen David, Star of David on top. So let's go see him. I go across the street where the office was, and I walk in and I say, I'll call him Mr. Parker. I'd like to see Mr. Parker. So the young blonde German girl who was sitting there playing a typewriter and chewing gum, she said, he's busy. I looked past her, and the other office is a guy sitting with his feet on a desk reading the Stars and Stripes. And then she corrects me and says, Colonel Parker. I said, sorry, I'd like to see Colonel Parker, he's busy. I said, can't you ask him if he see me? I can't disturb him. So I pushed the gate in to go through, and she started getting up and said, Fraulein, sitzen Sie. Remain seated. And she had been well trained in Nazi Germany. She sat down. I walk over to the other door, and I knock on the door, and I say, Colonel Parker? Down comes the paper, down come the feet. He says, yes. He says, Chaplain Wall here. Oh, he says, come in, Chaplain. I was his landlord because he was on territory that was being occupied by the 9th Division.
Oh, I see.
So he said, what can I do for you? Very polite. I said, first of all, you can explain the dilemma. I'm calling you Colonel. Yeah, I see you in Mufti. Oh, he says, I'm a retired officer in His Majesty's Palestinian forces. What can I do for you? So I tell him, well, I've got a bunch of people standing outside who seem to be not receiving yesterday the same treatment that the other DPs in the area. So he looks past me and he sees them. He says, oh, he said, it wouldn't help those Zionist bastards. So I zipped down my zipper. I pointed to the Magen David, the Star of David, and the Ten Commandments. I said, Colonel, I'm one of those bastards. I'll be back. I don't know how I got back to division headquarters. I must have walked 2 feet above the ground. It was so burned up right after the war is over. And get to the division headquarters, and I'm going past the adjutant's office, and he says to me, where are you going, Max? I said, I'm going to see the general. He said, wait a minute, let me... you don't go into a Stutar general just knocking on the door. So I knocked on the door, and the general opens the door, takes one look at me, he says, what happened? Because he liked generals. I mean, he liked chaplains. He did a lot of support for it. Mm-hmm. So as I started to explain to him, I began to calm down. He finally reached over the telephone and says, Egan, get me Paris. So I hear some squawking. He said, I don't give a damn, so you get me Paris. A few minutes later, the phone rings back. Yep. Want to talk to Ike. I said, is that you, Beadle Smith? Lieutenant General Bedell Smith was Ike's chief of staff. If you ever saw the movie Patton.
Yeah.
I never saw. Anyway, so he must have asked him, well, what's wrong? So he tells him the story, and he says, I want him out of here. So there's some more talk, and says, I'll see you next week. And he hangs up. You know, 5 stars are talking to each other. I was going to sneak out and stay there. So he starts asking me about the DPs, and I tell him all kinds of things that he didn't know, how they were suffering, even under American occupation. They were still being mistreated. They were being picked up by American MPs in Munich and robbed of whatever they were dealing with. So he put that into his mind, and it saved me later from a court-martial. That's another story. We were waiting a couple of minutes while they were talking, and Egan comes in with a knock on the door, says, the telegram. General looks at the telegram, very beetling brows, and he says, not my custom to use chaplains as messenger boys, but I'm going to make you a messenger boy for this message. And I read it. This is addressed to Colonel so-and-so Parker, retired, His Majesty's forces. Upon receipt of this telegram, you are immediately relieved from duty. You will report within 24 hours to Paris headquarters with all your records complete. Signed. So General looks at me. I said, thank you, sir. I take the telegram, walk across. She opens the gates for me this time. And I come in. I said, Colonel, you don't know me, and I hope I never know you any further. But I'm not a vengeful person. I can't possibly stand violence or anything like that. But I'll tell you right now, it's a pleasure to give you this telegram. Gave him the telegram. I turned and walked out. That was the end of an experience. Could you shut that off for a minute?
Yeah.
So you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about the village in Poland, and since you were 6 when you left, you might still remember a little bit of the, I take it was a Jewish shtetl.
That's a bad question because I can't even remember what I had for lunch last week. But, you know, you get transmitted not only your personal memories, but the memories of people who were living there at the time. And after a while, you begin to think that you actually remember those places. All I remember was a couple of buildings. You know, they didn't look very high. Remember, as Jews, we didn't exactly roam around town anywhere we wanted to at any time. Matter of fact, I was 3.5 years old, so I was playing with a hoop outside, and the hoop ran into a building. I didn't know it was a church. And somebody came out and took a look at me and slapped me violently across the face and called me Jew Christ killer in Polish. I came running home to my mother. Was a Jew Christ killer. Oh, she said, I forgot. It was Easter week, and we weren't supposed to be out during that week. It was, you know, it was that kind of experience. So all I remember that one of my mother's uncles had a store of some kind, and you had to walk up some wooden steps, and they had a kind of a long porch, the way you see in some of the western towns where they raise the sidewalk. And that's not a sidewalk, it's just a wooden...
Just get above the mud.
Yeah, get above the mud, that's right. But otherwise, I for whatever reason, I really have no... Yeah. Except for the Rabbi of Macheyev, who was a famous author of religious, legal religious material. I don't remember anything. I remember my relatives who were there, but I don't remember them ever being old because they were all wiped out.
And had they been there from time immemorial? I mean, had they been in that same community in Poland?
Yeah, and the same
as you all knew.
In the same general community, yes. I think some of them moved around a bit. My father came from a Lithuanian community and came to become the head of a Jewish school in Ratne, where he met my mother. But most of them lived in the same area. My mother's parents left for... My mother's uncle was brought to the United States in 1891 or 1890 by a burgeoning Jewish community from Denver, Colorado. They needed a shochet, a kosher slaughterer. I'm translating for whoever was going to. And so he came in 1890 and 91, and he met all the great and near great, as Mel Brooks says in his 2,000-year-old man. Buffalo Bill had even once offered him a buffalo to shecht, which is buffalo's kosher animal, but my granduncle turned it down. He was living there from 1891. So by the time we came there in 1921, it's been 30 years.
Yeah. That was I remember, this is a side topic, but didn't Golda Meir spend some time in Denver?
I don't know. Milwaukee was where she came from, yeah.
I know there was a large Jewish...
it was a very... I think when we came to Denver in the 20s, there must have been 40, 50,000 Jews living there. It was a very nice community.
So yeah, let's talk about Vermont then. So you came here shortly after your service.
I was assigned, I told you, to the 9th Infantry Division, and I met, when I was stationed in Fort Devens, I met somebody, a recruit, because it was a recruiting camp. You know, all the New England had to report through Camp Devens, just like Fort Dix was for the New York metropolitan area. And I met a fellow who was about 35. I said, "What are you doing in the service?" He says, "Well, I just missed it by 2 or 3 weeks, the age." And we got to know each other. I found he had 2 children. This guy doesn't belong in the service, so I tried to keep him with me as a temporary assistant while we could do something about it, but he was transferred out. And when I didn't see him, I got to Verviers, which was a small Belgian town near the German-Belgian border. And there he is. "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well," he says, "I've gotten a promotion. Now I'm an assistant to an Army Corps chaplain." So he told me, he says, "You're going to be assigned to the 9th Infantry Division. There's a Jewish boy from Burlington, Vermont, who's a medic there. He's a doctor. And you'll get to know him because he's a rather religious person, and he'll be coming to service wherever possible." Sure enough, I'm driving along the road to go to 47th Infantry, and it was snowing. A bunch of GIs and the officer were standing by the side of the road, hitching a ride. And we stopped. He said, "You Chaplain Wall?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, welcome to the division. We're coming to services. You can give us a ride?" And we slipped on, and everybody, we got there. So from then on, Meyer Boyarsky became a very good friend of mine. He was a wonderful human being. And every time we had service at the 47th, he always brought a jeep load of...
And this was he was the medic.
He was the medic. He was a doctor, a graduate of UVM. Mm-hmm. Just before Pesach, I saw him, and he said, "Don't forget to bring me some matzahs and kosher wine." This is in the wine country of Germany. And we were at the Remagen Bridge. That's where we were staying before we crossed over. I said, "Fine." By the time I got to Namur and back from Namur, Belgium, to the Rhine River, we had broken through. Infantry was traveling on tanks, trucks, jeeps, everything. So I had to start chasing my regiments. And I got to the 47th headquarters. I discovered that he had been killed the day before by a strafing German plane. So I participate in some prayers for him at the cemetery later on. And that was the end of it. I get to Burlington, Vermont for my first interview as a possible candidate for the rabbinate here in Burlington. I walk in, and I still have my uniform on. I didn't have a chance to get any civilian clothes. And a voice calls out from the synagogue, "Did you know my son?" So I said, "What's your name?" So he tells me my name is Boyarsky. He says, "Was your son Meyer Boyarsky?" He says, "Yes." And I started to tell him all about Meyer Boyarsky, the doctor. And I was interviewed and I was offered the job, but I had to speak in Yiddish. After going to 4 years of the seminary, I thought I would be addressing a congregation in English.
Here in Burlington?
Here in Burlington, we were speaking Yiddish. So I said, "Don't I speak in English?" He said, "Well, tomorrow night you'll speak in English, Sunday night." So that's the way it was. I decided right then and there, this is one place I'm not coming to. Well, as it turned out, I wasn't treated. I saw what Burlington was like and didn't want it. The next night after I spoke in English, one of the people came over to me and said, "How much do you want?" So I said to him, "That's the wrong question to start with. First you ask me, would you like to come here? And my answer is no." "What do you mean no?" Well, I left, and next day I got a call from the seminary headquarters, the placement committee. "Hey, they want you, and they want you to come back. You'll meet some more people." So I came back, met at the home of this fellow who asked me how much I want. It turned out to become a very good friend, naturally. And there was a bunch of young people, all veterans who just returned, like myself. So I made a deal with them. If you don't split off and start another community, another separate congregation, stick with me and work together with me, we'll see if we can build a kind of congregation that we all want. They said yes, and I said yes for a year. And I got stuck in the snow, and that was it for 41 years. What kind of a community did I find here? It was a shtetl community. It lived in one section of town.
What part of town was that?
The old North End. They had been here for quite a while. The synagogue, the first synagogue building that they had built was in 1910. They had started a congregation from 1885. So they were pretty old. They came basically from Lithuanian Jews. And they had all the services. They had a rabbi, they had a couple of shoctim, they had a couple of kosher butchers, they had a Talmud Torah, for education. But it was falling apart because it changed radically. When the Jewish kids who were my contemporaries and joined me at that promise were kids, they used to have to gather together to walk to school, because if they walked separately, chances are they'd be assaulted, because they were Jewish. That was the kind of community I came to. Most of the Jews at that time were what I would call non-observant Orthodox. In other words, they wanted their rabbi to be a very punctilious, strict observer of all the mitzvot and traditions. But for me, I remember laughing to myself when I'd take a walk on Shabbos and I would see members of the congregation beginning to look very furtive and holding their hands behind their back because they were smoking a cigarette and they didn't want the rabbi to see they were smoking. That kind of a community. But that was the way a good part of American Jewry was at that time.
And were they mostly
immigrants,
store owners, and that sort of
well,
thing?
no, they were. A lot of them were in the cattle business, live and meat. Some of them owned stores. The largest store in town was owned by Frank family. when I came there were a number of lawyers already, a number of doctors. But many of them had these tiny little bakers, you know. We used to get bread delivered from the Jewish bakery, you know, by a delivery truck, horse and wagon originally, and later on by a truck. He'd come in and spend a half hour taking my time talking about everything, and gossip, you know. There were butchers, and you had to vie for a decent piece of meat because that's the way butchers treated their customers. We had a shochet who was also a baltfiller, the equivalent of a cantor, who was just a wonderful guy. He must have been about 15 years older than I was when I came, but an old-fashioned Eastern European Jew. He spoke Engels, not English, but he was the most kindly, wonderful human being you wanted. So it was easy for me to take over whatever I suggested to the congregation that we do, or whatever direction. Reverend Nadelson was always supportive. Mm-hmm. So, ask the rabbi. And he had a beautiful voice. So it was very lovely. When I first came, the majority of Jews lived in one area of town. Within 4 or 5 years after having been in Burlington, Jews were spreading out into the larger city and pretty soon into the suburbs. When I came, what I found was, of course, a terrible ignorance of Judaism, not only among Jews, but among the non-Jewish population as well, including the clergy. They knew very little. When they quoted the Old Testament, which I can't stand the word, I think it's about time that they started using the word Hebrew Scripture. It used to make me... But they didn't know much about Jewish history or anything. There was a complete separation between knowing the Jew and the Jew as a Christ relationship. Well, I was the only rabbi in the area. The nearest rabbi was 70 miles away in Rutland, 65 miles away. And then the other Jewish community was up in Montreal. So I was pretty much alone. You know, and rabbis have a rather lonely position anyways. I mean, we have lots of friends, but we're very lonely. And so if we have other rabbis, that becomes a kind of a gemütliche thing. But so I had to look for friends, and the only way I could look for friends was among the clergy, the Christian clergy. And apparently, you know, I was a new face in town, so I was invited to speak at this church or that church. And pretty soon we got to know each other, and I suggested we start a class and a discussion among the clergy, and we had a discussion group going. We started studying the Bible. It included Catholics as well. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it went. In the meantime, we started building a conservative congregation. I'm not being sarcastic or ironic when I say that's a non-observant Orthodox. Emotionally, they still felt guilty about not doing the things they're supposed to do, but they didn't do them. Mm-hmm. No, you know such people, and they were still kleinstädtlich. They didn't have any large view of the Jewish community of America, for example. Everything was small townish in extent. And I tried to get across here. First of all, I came filled with information about the DPs. So I was an angry man when I came. And they put up with it. As I'm looking back, I realized how much they had to put up with this young whippersnapper who was having problems adjusting to life completely because of the Holocaust. But I got a group of these young fellows. They started helping for Friday night services. We never had the late Friday night services. You know, it was a short service with a sermon afterwards, or a lecture, or a visiting lecture. We started singing in the service, teaching them all kinds of traditional melodies. It was an exciting thing for everybody. Pretty soon we had a sisterhood going, we had a men's club going, in addition to support the actual ongoing work of the congregation.
I'm fine. Yeah.
I came in 1946, and in 1948 I started to murmur about, this is an old-fashioned shul where they had a balcony for the women upstairs. Except when I came, we joined the congregation for the Friday night services, men and women together on Friday nights. But on Shabbos morning, the men still sat downstairs and the women upstairs. And same for the holidays. And I didn't want that. I wanted an integrated kind of service. So eventually we got around to maybe in the third year. But I started complaining about the size of the synagogue because the Talmud Torah was in a separate building. And I ran the Talmud Torah. We had one teacher and I who, the first summer when I came for official duty in August, that's when I began my service. So he and I went literally from Jewish home to Jewish home and registered about what would have been 95% of all the Jewish kids who were available. Mm. So we ended up with a school at the height of the history when we probably had 135, 140 children of school age.
And two teachers.
Well, no, we added some more part-time teachers. But then eventually we got a full-time professional educator as a principal and other regular teachers. So we did very well. And those kids who grew up in those years still are comfortable in the synagogue. They can daven, they can do haftorah, and all the stuff they learned at that time. And I started, we had a junior congregation for the kids. And Shabbos, I asked the kids, we had a crack in the front of the shul near the ceiling. I said, pray that it gets larger. Okay. Well, we started the building fund, and in 1952 we put up the building that we're living in now on North Prospect Street, which to us was a very beautiful and very spacious, and we had everything together. We had a gymnasium and a hall and a major sanctuary and a little shulachol nearby, another room for the daily minyan, and a kitchen and, milchike, fleischike kitchen. We were able to serve meals and all that kind of stuff. It was a very thriving kind of thing. And I used to started bringing mostly church groups into the synagogue for tours. Mm-hmm. And one day, 1964, I get a call from the secretary of the president of St. Michael's College, which is a Catholic college. He says, the president wants to apologize to you for that scurrilous letter that was in the Free Press this morning about Jews. One of the faculty members there was an anti-Semite, and a vicious anti-Semite. So I said, well, why is the president apologizing? He didn't write the letter. He says, Max, he says, I'm trying to do something nice, so please don't give me a hard time. I said, I mean it. And if you don't like it, he wasn't very popular either. Why don't you get rid of him? He said, well, he's got tenure. And I said, and anti-Semitism is not the cause. So I said, I have a suggestion for you. Since you're a Catholic school, you're not bound by the church-state problems, and you have lots of clergy who teach there. I would suggest you get at least another Jew who can speak a Jewish point of view on the same campus. If you can't shut him up, that would be fair. And since you have so many clergy who are teaching there as professors, I would suggest the equivalent would be a rabbi, and I know just the rabbi. He says, hey, that sounds like a good idea. Let me run it before the president. So he called me up 2 days later. Says, the president thought it was a great idea, but would you mind coming in through the back door? Who says the back door? I said, well, what do you mean back door? He says, well, some of the old fathers, when he discussed it with them, were kind of squeamish about the thought that a rabbi would actually be teaching Catholic students about something else other than Catholic religion. So he said, would you mind coming into the graduate school in the summer to begin with? So I did. That summer, I walked into a class. There were about 38 nuns and about 5 seminarians. And I didn't know with what you start and what you begin. I knew that there was supposed to be a prayer in the beginning. We got along fine. That summer was a love fest between us. At the end of the first week, a nun comes over to me and she said, you assigned us a term paper. Can't seem to find a subject that's of interest. So I had just received a book called The Teaching of Contempt by Jules Isaac, a teacher, a French philosophy teacher, who had sent this book to Pope John the 23rd to support his arguments that they should include in Vatican II a Jewish theme. Mm-hmm. And he pointed out the teaching of contempt over the centuries. So I had just gotten it the day before, and I was looking at it. So I said, well, why don't you try the subject of the church and anti-Semitism? So in all simplicity and naivete, she says to me, well, is there any material? So I almost couldn't keep from smiling. I said, well, we can find some material. I gave her a bibliography from the church fathers on, and I gave her this book, The Teaching of Contempt. That was on Friday. On Monday, she comes over to me and she says, I can't understand if any of this is 10% true. I don't know where I stand with my church. So for the next 3 weeks, you find the interesting, anomalous experience of a rabbi counseling a nun to keep her faith strong. In the middle of the semester, we had a confraternity of Christian doctrine where they would bring in all teachers of religion from the parochial schools for a conference showing the latest educational materials since I was new on campus. So they asked me to bring materials from the Talmud Torah, and Jewish education and so on. And I was introduced by a priest who was a very close friend of mine at the time, with whom I became friends when I first came to town, Monsignor Fitzsimons. He gets up and he says as follows. He says, he raises his hand and says, these hands have either been too often raised in shedding Jewish blood or have hung idly by our side and no protest when it was being done. Therefore, I welcome this special opportunity to welcome Rabbi Wall and to welcome a new approach to the Jewish people and to Jewish religion, and introduce me. I gave my speech, and I saw a nun, Sister Elizabeth, walking towards me. You ever seen a motorboat cleaving the water, it peels the water aside? She was peeling people aside with a beatific look on her face. She comes over to me finally. She says, thank you for your speech. I said, you look wonderful, sister. What happened? She says, now that Monsignor has said it, I can write it. She went on to get a doctorate at Brown in Judaic studies. Mm-hmm. So those were the experiences. Part of my service to this community was breaking into the larger community, not giving up my Judaism, but affirming it in public. So,
I was going to say, I was interviewing somebody in Laconia, New Hampshire, a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me about how in that community, and I'm sure this being Vermont, that there were quite a few of the, the people not of the Catholic background, but of the Puritan lineage, who there was one Jewish fellow in Laconia that he said was always being consulted by these, these Protestant clergy as well, as the expert on.
Well, that's right.
The Hebrew.
Well, here I am, an ordained expert, so it was easy for me. I was teaching courses in Hebrew at the Episcopal Cathedral. That's the top house for all the Episcopalians in the state of Vermont. 2-week courses. It was that kind of a relationship. I was putting on seders in churches during the week of Easter, because they got to realize that matzah and wafer are the same thing. That kind of stuff. But what it did was effectively change the attitude of the Jewish people. They didn't behave as the old shtetl people. They began to walk, straight, upright, which was, of course, a remarkable psychological thing. And then as time went on, of course, more and more Jewish people began to move into the area too.
I was going to ask how
when I came,
how has the community changed in that regard?
When I came, there was only one synagogue, the Ohavizedek congregation. There were 3 synagogue buildings in town, because like the maroon sailor, and that synagogue I don't step foot.
Yeah,
that kind of thing. But 3 separate congregations at one time, and eventually the reason for separation disappeared, because none of them were observant. But there were 3 buildings which eventually we ended up owning, and it was a vibrant shtetl, everything they had. But by the time I got there, there was only one synagogue in operation. For the holidays, they used to meet still in 2 separate congregations. And there must have been about, I would say, maybe 200 families. I think today we probably have closer to 1,000, maybe 1,200 Jewish families in Greater Burlington. It was many, many years after I came when its 25th anniversary last year, 2 years ago. And then about 10, 12 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, Lubavitch came in. And they started out with somebody living across the street, a Lubavitcher rabbi, who we used to understand to be a shaliach, a messenger of the Rabbi, the Lubavitcher Rabbi, Shneir Zalman, Schneerson. That's right. And now we have Ohavizedek, which is conservative. They have Temple Sinai, which is Reform. They have about 250 members. We have about 400 members. The Lubavitch they cater to the whole community. They don't have many members as such. People who go to their minyan, maybe 50 families. And then about 4 years ago, a group broke away from our synagogue and made a new congregation. And so they have about 50 people. There are many more non-affiliated Jews living in the Greater Burlington area than there were when I first came. When I first came, you pointed out at lunch, you had to belong if you're a small town. Otherwise, you really feel lost. Maybe 95% of the Jews in the area were associated. They didn't like it, didn't like the rabbi, didn't like the chazan, or whatever it was. But what can you do? You still have it to be buried in the Jew. So that we had the control there. No matter what else we do, we're going to get you. You'd be surprised how these kinds of disciplines affect the behavior, the support. And there were lots of people who supported us who were not very concerned about services that we gave them. When we started our building fund, we went to the non-Jewish community too. We had a meeting with the prominent people in the community, and my friend who asked me, how much do you want for salary, who's now a good friend of mine, is a very prominent member of the community, convened these people in his house right on the corner here. And I started getting up to make some kind of an appeal. And one of I think the president of the hospital at the time, Fritz Shepardson, gets up and says, "Rabbi," he says, "why don't you sit down and let me talk instead?" He said, I sat down and he said, "You know, this guy is very good at asking people for others. I'm going to ask for him now. What are we going to do?" I think they raised something like $40,000 to $50,000 for the building of the synagogue.
Now, it seems to me, as a non-Vermonter, that Vermont, at least in the the last 25 years, there are many Jews that have sort of a public profile.
Oh yes.
In this state. I mean, is that a development of the last couple of decades, or?
Oh yes. I mean, we've had prominent attorneys who were appointed for temporary services as judges. Of course, we had a Jewish governor, Madeline Kunin. An interesting story. We had a former governor, Governor Snelling, Richard Snelling, who died in office, had a heart attack. A comparatively young man. And I get a call from a very close friend of mine who's a lawyer. He says, "Mrs. Snelling wants you to officiate at the memorial service at the house, in Montpelier." I said, "They're not Jewish." He said, "Well, you call her Barbara Snelling." Well, I called Barbara Snelling. She said, "No, I want you to officiate at the memorial service at the house chambers." Very odd thing. So I did. I ran the service and I spoke words about him. As I was going out of the house onto the lawn, they were going to plant a tree in memory of Governor Snelling. I overheard two legislators talking. One says to the other, "I didn't know that Governor Snelling was Jewish." So it's gone that far. They started inviting rabbis for opening prayers at every legislative session, and governor installation. I was appointed to various committees, and I sound like a telephone pole, but I don't mean that. I mean, I was the only rabbi around for many, many years, and so they used me. I was the official rabbi for the hospital system, including the mental hospital. I was the official rabbi for the prison system. So I had
how many Jewish?
We had all kinds of interesting experiences. But fundamentally, I think the Jewish community grew, and it grew with pride. It always had pride in itself. It just realized, no respect. I'm using that word in quotes. But gradually they began to, and the more pride they began to have, the less they began to participate in active Jewish religious services. Who needs it now? I'm here already. That kind of thing. So today, Vermont Jewry, I don't know, it probably has close to 2,000 families. The big communities are Burlington, of course, Rutland. They have synagogue in Brattleboro.
Manchester?
In Manchester. Yeah, Michael Cohen used to be rabbi in Manchester there. In Montpelier, now they have a full-time rabbi. Stowe has a community organization of about maybe 250 families, family units, many of whom are second home owners from Canada.
Yeah.
A lot of Montreal Jews come down and have that.
And also, I think, New York.
Yeah. But a lot of Canadians come up to Stowe. So they started a congregation. They'll probably get a rabbi soon. And things are really growing. We're starting a building program to enhance and improve the building.
Yeah, I noticed I was driving about a year ago, I think in Woodstock, Vermont. There may or may not be a synagogue there, but there's a Jewish community center.
Yeah.
Which looked like it was brand new.
Yeah. They probably asked Rockefeller to support it there.
Uh-huh.
I think he has a home there.
Oh, I see.
There's a lot of money in Vermont. Now, what questions do you have specifically?
Well, I just one little additional one, because I probably need to get back on the road. But you mentioned something I've been hearing a lot in the interviews about Jewish cattle dealers, and you'd mentioned that when you first came,
Yeah.
you knew some of the. What did these people do? Were they the suppliers to all the dairy farms? Or?
No, I think it was mostly suppliers of meat sources.
Uh-huh.
So some of them had slaughterhouses, and they slaughter for the butcher, for the meat markets in the area. And I'd say there were about 5 families when I came to the small community that were all in the cattle business. And they didn't talk to each other. The old competitor approach. But they not only they supported themselves, but they did very well. Mm-hmm. They were among the so-called richer people in town. But Burlington, like most other communities in the country, started out perhaps with a peddler. Peddler is a very important element in American history. I mean, he bound the communities together in many ways. But the peddlers come, and when those peddlers started coming, most of them came directly from Europe, and most of them came from Eastern Europe, and most of Eastern Europe was still basically a very observant community. So kosher and Shabbos meant a great deal to these people. Mm-hmm. And they go out into the wilderness, and here's what they're going to eat for kosher. Well, the farmers gradually learned about it, so they give them eggs, give them milk, and they hadn't managed how to make a living. And pretty soon they were much more comfortable, and so they'd stay for the whole week, or they'd rent a room somewhere, And before long, a bunch of them found themselves in a town like Burlington and said, why don't we make a minion? See, if we've got 8 people here already, we need 2 more families, and that's how it got started in Burlington. I think the first Jews, I'd like to recommend the book to you, but I don't have it any longer. Somebody borrowed it from me. It's The History of the Jews of Burlington by Myron Samuelson. Maybe Perlmutter has a copy.
I'll look for it. It should be.
It would probably be in the Burlington Library. Or it's in the synagogue library, or Havazeric Synagogue, which gives you a lot of factual information about the birth and growth of the Jewish community. He was a lawyer who wrote about it. I don't know much more about the details of their cattle business, but they were they were cattle business. They were cattle people in Montpelier, St. Johnsbury, in Newport. All obviously interrelated. You get a member of the family over. So what are you going to do? Well, you can come with me in the truck, and I'll show you what to do. Pretty soon, he's got a truck, and he's doing the same thing. And they were all, many of them were interrelated by blood. So that's how there were cattle dealers, pretty much all over, north, east, west, south. There's a great deal of influence, I imagine, from the Jewish communities in the New York area, but maybe as much as the influence from Massachusetts going upwards.
Yeah. The